Nick, I see you're sort of lobbying certain people there. If you are ready to move on, and if you haven't put your pink posters up, please put them on so that we can move forward. It's with great pleasure that the third speaker in this first session is Professor Peter Midmore, who has worked extremely hard looking at economics and agriculture in particular over his lifetime as an academic in Aberystwyth. We do have academics that fail to grasp that local sort of need here, but Peter has extended his hand out to local communities on all sorts of things. I mean, I've had discussions with Peter, not always agreeing with Peter, on many aspects of sheep farming, and he will speak today on why sheep. He graduated here in 1982, and he gained his PhD in agriculture economics, and he was appointed research associate and then lecturer in agriculture economics, and was appointed to a chair in 1998, initially in rural studies, which has evolved, and this institute itself is evolving, but we are so lucky to have so many great academics in the institute. He is a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts and the Higher Education Academy, and a member of the Institute of Welsh Affairs. He is now undertaking a degree in fine arts, so what we saw last night, he is also a specialist in that area. Felly, croeso cynnes I Peter. Diolch.
Yes. Well, while we're fixing this issue, I'll just say thank you, John, for that kind of introduction. I wouldn't say I'm an expert in art. I've just finished the first year of the fine art degree, so I feel rather nervous about the attention that's drawn to that. I want to shift the perspective a little bit. We've heard an awful lot about historical issues, and I want to set my sights firmly on the future. And the way I want to do that, I think, if we can imagine culture as being embodied history, culture is obviously very influential in the way that it shapes ideas, and the ideas of the present will be the foundation. The future is inherently unknowable. Nobody knows what's going to happen next week, next year, next century. But what we can be sure of is that ideas will have an influence over how that emerges. So I want to frame my contribution to this symposium around the idea of the mindset. Mindset is part of the way we function cognitively. It's not easy to define, but it's a set of attitudes and beliefs that shape the way that we think about things. You could say, and what I prefer to imagine it as, is a sort of pre-analytic vision. It's what you use as the guidance to choose on how you understand facts and how you use them. Others might call it unkindly prejudice, but nevertheless we all have mindsets. They do differ, and what I want to do is to explore three stylized mindsets in order to open up some of the discussion that we obviously need to have in this somewhat complicated and certainly controversial set of topics that are raised by thinking about sheep and the landscape. So I think you'll recognise these mindsets. The first one I would call a sort of rural development, food security mindset. This one sees farmers as predominantly as managers of the environment for social benefit. Right? So particularly food, but also the way in which we manage the environment has consequences for the natural interests and ecosystem services, whatever way that works. The second mindset that I want to explore, you might call restoration ecology, or we might know it more familiarly as rewilding, which really is focusing on a restoration of natural processes in order to improve lost or declining ecosystem services. Then the third mindset, which I probably feel more qualified to speak about, is the conventional economics mindset, very influential as far as policymakers are concerned. Of the three, probably the one I feel you'll be surprised by, there's the least sympathy with. But as I have spent, John draws attention to the fact that I've been here a long time, I've worked it out, I've been teaching conventional economics to students, albeit with a sceptical flavour, for 34 years. So I should be able to give you at least an accurate account of this mindset if I'm way off with the other two. And that's what I'm going to start with, mainly because I want to initiate a dynamic in what I'm going to say, and I'm conscious of the fact that the timetable is slipping a little bit, so I don't want to go on. And I am prone to go on and on and on a bit, but I'll try and curb that tendency. So for economists, the question is not so much why sheep, but why so many sheep? And the answer they would provide is that agriculture in general in the EU is protected from competition from cheaper imports from the rest of the world, particularly by, most importantly, by heavy taxes on imports or tariffs, but also by informal agreements like the one with New Zealand in terms of the amount of sheep meat that's imported into the United Kingdom tariff-free, and also subsidies to farmers, the most important of which and the most costly of which is the basic income payment. Now, it's certainly not the case that upland sheep farmers are heavily subsidised. Far from it. But actually is that the influence of those subsidies on other parts of agriculture are all connected because of the way in which the price of grain, which is raised by tariffs, is an important input into livestock production, particularly the sort of competitors to sheep of pork and chicken. That raises their prices, so that means that in terms of the choice that consumer faces, although obviously Welsh lamb is not cheap, as most people will know. So the effect of that is to actually raise the prices of food for everybody, but that has its greatest impact amongst people who can least afford to buy food. So actually, tariffs on agricultural imports are a tax on the poor. We're increasingly concerned about inequality and particularly food issues of nutrition, malnutrition, overnutrition, or whatever. The way in which this is a huge emotional issue for most people. So economists would say, well, actually, these barriers are detrimental to our overall social interest. We should get rid of them. And as a result of that, well, there wouldn't stop the sheep farming in the hills and uplands of Wales, but only the more efficient producers would be able to remain in business. Maybe quite a lot of land would go out of agriculture, become forested. These are jolly good soaking up devices for carbon, so what's not to like? Well, actually quite a lot. Mainly because economics, as I'm sure you're aware, has become an increasingly mathematical discipline, especially over the period in which I've been practicing professionally. And one of the consequences of mathematization, I said that word carefully because it's quite a tongue twister, is that you need to make some simplifying assumptions. Now, the argument is that these actually, if you're thinking about large-scale social phenomena like the operation of markets and so on, it doesn't really matter, they get immersed. But when you're thinking about an area as particular and localized as upland agriculture, then they begin to break down in a number of really important ways. The first is, technically, the assumptions that are most important are of perfect divisibility of factors of production. What does that mean? It means everything can be divided. You can operate things on broadly whatever scale you like. And also that there are constant economies of scale in the way that the economy. Neither is true, obviously, but it's important in the context of agriculture, and especially so in the hills and uplands, in terms of the size and nature of the farming business that can exist. farming businesses are both location and space constrained, most obviously through topography, but also because farms adjacent to a holding that you might want to take over in order to expand your business, in order to make it more, to increase the amount of income. I wouldn't say make it more profitable, because it probably wouldn't be on a per unit basis. But so because of that, farms tend to be family businesses, and they tend to be heritable family businesses, and so they exist through time, and because of that, farmers build up a very strong attachment to the land that they work and the profession they follow, the vocation, which is involved in being a farmer. With the consequence that, as a group, they don't behave very much as if the way in which economists think they ought to behave, rationally, and so we're constantly being surprised at what happens in response to the kind of policies that we implement. Well, I think I'm fairly comprehensively trashed the reputation of the agricultural economics profession in 3 minutes. So let's go on to see what we can do with regard to the rural as food security perspective and the rewilding perspective. So that's this second mindset is the one that's most associated with these august buildings that we find ourselves in today. It's one that's founded very strongly, apologies John, on the use of science and technology to improve the performance. You know, this is farmers as being managing the environment through technological improvement in order to get a win-win situation, in order to get a landscape that we can admire and enjoy, a set of ecosystem services, including carbon storage and flood abatement and so on. So it's actually engineering the framework of the uplands in order to produce a livelihood, a good livelihood, or at least an acceptable livelihood for farmers, and also all the other benefits that we, as broad as social animals, require. And at the heart of this perspective, it is the idea that farming is the driving force of the rural economy. That without farming, the rural economy would be very much poorer, and possibly even with a reduction in farming viability, that would set off a chain reaction that eventually would lead to complete depopulation, collapse, both social and environmental, of the systems that exist in the uplands in central Wales. This perspective recognises the economic fragility of the farming business, but sees the cultural and the social dimension of farming as being really central, as being undervalued and therefore neglected. So I think that the mindset in this case would say it's not a matter of why sheep, but what sheep? What kind of sheep do we want? We want sheep that, with a certain amount of genetic intervention and not only sheep but their food supply and the way the whole thing is managed, would actually generate all of those things, and we'd all be better off as a result. Well, unfortunately, this perspective is based fairly strongly on nostalgia. We all know what nostalgia does. It makes the good things of the past appear to be perhaps more attractive than they really were, and the good things that have happened since then in the present are undervalued. Right? So we feel an attraction to a framework of exploitation of the uplands which probably didn't result in the goods that we thought it did, and vice versa, that the way that we view the present landscape is actually not producing the things we think it ought to. I think that one of the important, well, there are two things on which you can deconstruct this perspective. The first is that actually there's been an awful lot of movement of people out of farming, and an awful lot of taking over of the next door farm and the next door farm but one, in order that there should be, as Ian said, you need to put food on the table. The family has expectations. They're part of the modern world. They don't want to be in the sort of poverty that exists. It's as well to remember that small farms, poor people in Ceredigion gave rise to the idea of an often jocular but actually very serious idea that Cardis are mean. Like, why are Cardis mean? Because they had to look after every blooming penny in order to survive. And it was one of the last areas of the country where TB as an endemic problem was actually finally, in the 1950s, conquered. So that, there has been change, and that change has been important, and it's not only been in terms of the farming structure, but also in terms of the impacts of farming, the way that farming has been managed. So one thing that I would point out is that the balance between sheep and cattle in grazing has changed enormously over the past few years, principally driven by economics, but the consequence of it for the quality and the interest of the upland environment has been quite profound. Actually more profound, I think, than any kind of restoration approach driven by science and technology could actually re-establish. The other thing that I would note is that one of the small contributions that I may have made to this discussion as a researcher is that if you took farming away completely from the uplands of Wales, the economic impact would be negligible. Because there's so few farms, because actually of the way in which those farms now relate to the wider economy, and in fact we will have experienced far more economic dislocation as a result of the austerity policies of the Westminster government over the past decade or more, in terms of local government expenditure. More money has been taken out of local government expenditure and the provision of services in Wales than would disappear if farming ceased completely. It's never going to cease completely. So I think we need to use that to put into, this is the kind of economic catastrophe or not that we may face if the wilder predictions of the effects of a hard Brexit, sorry, I didn't mean to mention Brexit, actually materialise. Now then, the third mindset that I want to discuss is much less clear-cut, harder even to define than the other elements that I've been talking about. In fact, I think that you can characterize it as a set of controversies nested in the wider controversy that we're talking about today, which at their core contain an ironic double paradox. I thought very carefully about crafting that particular sentence. But what I mean is that there's no disagreement, I think, on the core fact that people have induced ecological change. Maybe the roots of that ecological change go back to the early Neolithic period, but maybe they've accelerated over the past. But essentially, there would be agreement that people have caused ecological change, and there are various myths that have emerged as to what period in prehistory we should actually be using as a benchmark for rewilding. So that's the first part of the paradox. The second part of the paradox is that in terms of actually achieving rewilding, we have to manage the environment, perhaps not more intensively, but more deliberatively. And even then we don't know whether the resulting ecosystem that we produce as a result of that more deliberative management would actually be one which resembled these mythical pristine ecosystems that we had before people started to mess about with them, or whether it would be some completely novel ecosystem that produced a stream of consequences which we cannot at this point foresee. So actually the whole bag is completely mixed and undigestible. Now, I've got that off my chest, and I will say immediately, it's completely unfair. It's a very pejorative representation of what rewilding is actually about. Rewilding is driven by concerns about the level of soil erosion, the loss of biodiversity, the consequences for water, for carbon storage, and all the rest of it. And it produces anxiety. It produces anxiety because apparently, or maybe even actually, people who don't understand the driving forces behind the rewilding movement are complacent and allowing things to slide out of control, and people feel powerless. So I think we have to recognise that as an important driver of the whole debate. That it's not just that the mindset of rewilding is one which is fairly integrated, coherent. It's just that we haven't worked it out to the same degree as we have perhaps the other two perspectives that I've been criticising. Okay, so I want on that note to start summing up. I think different mindsets frame the issues. What they do is that they allow us to observe common facts or experiences and interpret them in completely different ways. Now, I'm not going to try to end up with some kind of mushy, well, you know, if we all could understand each other's mindsets, at least a little bit better, then we could move smoothly towards more of a consensus. I don't think that's really possible or helpful. Mindsets change, but they change very slowly, and if you want to shift them dramatically, then it's very, very hard work. But what I do want to do is to pose a number of questions. And I will actually only pose one question at the end. So my objective here is more pragmatic. It is to try to establish some red lines, if you like. Again, sorry about the allusion to but the idea is, I mean, if you are a proponent, if you want more or perhaps better sheep, maybe not more but better sheep, then what I think you have to do is you have to demonstrate to people who hold a different view how issues relating to climate change and habitat loss and the deterioration of ecosystem services can be addressed alongside that primary objective. If on the other hand you want fewer sheep and you want to improve the supply of ecosystem services, what you have to do is you have to demonstrate to people whose roots are very deep and whose attachment is very strong, even though they're the last remaining few of a much larger community. You have to demonstrate to them how they can continue to feel professionally valued and to earn a decent living and achieve your objectives. So it's about trying to reconcile at least, how far can all of the sides of the debate move towards each other with recognising the interests of people who don't think like them, and perhaps not resolve the issue, but at least think of ways in which bits of it can be reconciled. In my own field, I think there is an emerging view that the target of government policy should not be economic growth, but should be resilience. I think resilience is an equally, sorry Diana, but I think you'll recognise this, as equally a slippery concept as sustainability. And the only way that it can effectively be demonstrated is through local examples. And here we have a very important and difficult local example where we need to be able to find a way in which we can recognise that it is becoming more resilient. Not from all sides of the debate, it looks as though it's becoming less resilient. But what we need to do is turn that round. So my question to you is, how could you satisfy the concerns of people who don't think in the same way as you, in order to make your vision of the uplands more attractive to them?